This is Rabbi Shmuel Herzfeld of Ohev Shalom, the National Synagogue, speaking to you from the sacred studios of Ohev Shalom, the National Synagogue, located at 16th and Jonquil Street in the nation's capital. We are the oldest and the largest Orthodox synagogue in the nation's capital. And our guest on this sunny Sunday morning is one of the most distinguished women in the entire country, if not the world, a lioness of a woman. Her name is a household name, known to all. Her name is Mrs. Anette Lantos. Boker Tov, good morning, Mrs. Lantos, and welcome on Shmoozin' with Shmuel.
Good morning. I'm delighted to be here.
Now, Mrs. Lantos, if I could ask you, just to, in 1 minute, we're going to go forwards before we go backwards. We know now that you've, since the passing of your husband, the great Congressman Tom Lantos, you've started a foundation. Can you tell us a little bit about that foundation and how it will affect the lives of our listeners?
Well, the name of our foundation is the Tom Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice. And the purpose of our foundation is to keep the spirit of my husband alive and keep doing the things that he would want us to do and keep basically the issues that he really cared for alive and in front of the American public. We have had several programs. Our last program that our foundation sponsored in the capital was with the Dalai Lama, who spoke. You know, the Dalai Lama is a great friend of persecuted people all over the world, and we have a lot of in common with him because, as you know, the Chinese have basically taken over his country, and he has been a fugitive since 1949. He is living in India and trying to speak up for the persecuted and oppressed Tibetan people. And he has been in Israel several times and spoken and feels a great connection with the Jewish community all over the world.
Many of his followers are born Jewish.
Exactly. It's true. The Jewish communities everywhere are very much committed to him. That has been our last program. And we are hopefully going to have some programs, that feature, the plight of the Jewish people who are still trying, to get their freedom and get to Israel. There are still a lot of persecuted and oppressed Jews still in the parts of the Soviet Union, not in Moscow. That has been, of course, one of our major issues for my husband, to get the Soviet Jews to Israel. Now, most people, of course, think that issue has been finished, but we are aware that there are still many communities, sometimes just for the lack of money, that they are not able really to leave that country.
So what does your foundation do for them?
Basically, just keep the issues alive. We cannot, at this point, we are not wealthy enough, to be able to finance them, but to keep the issue alive and to speak about them.
Well, one of the most powerful films I've ever seen in my life was the film where Congressman Tom Lantos went back to look at his village, and was done by Steven Spielberg. Yes. Can you tell us a little bit, were you involved with the making of that film?
Oh yes, we were very much involved, and I'm also appear in the film, but very much just as accompanying my husband. Yes, The Last Days.
What was the title again?
The title was The Last Days.
The Last Days.
And it was basically about the last death pangs of the Nazis, with which they wanted to bring down the last intact Jewish community in Europe, which was in Hungary. And they came into the Nazis occupied Hungary in March of 1944. They had about 9 more months before the end of the war, maybe a little more. It was a year and 2 months before the end of the war. But of course, the end of the war in Hungary came in January, and between March 1944 and January 17, 1945, they deported over 600,000 Jews to Auschwitz. very few of them ever survived. Most of them went directly to the gas chamber. And actually, it was only the Jews of Budapest who had a slight chance, who were given a slight chance for survival by Raoul Wallenberg, the young Swedish diplomat who came to Hungary and heroically and under amazingly cruel circumstances, nevertheless managed to save at least 100,000 Jews, including my husband and myself.
So Raoul Wallenberg saved you and your husband?
Yeah, Raoul Wallenberg saved me.
Wow, you must have been special.
And then the Russians kidnapped him, took him to Siberia. We have not heard of him. So my husband's first step that he took, even before he was sworn into Congress, but even before we had an office, was to drop in a piece of legislation making Raoul Wallenberg the second honorary citizen of the United States. The first honorary citizen of the United States was Winston Churchill.
Wow.
And Raoul Wallenberg was the second honorary citizen of the United States. And we were hoping with that mechanism to be able to deal with the Russians, because the Swedes were so intimidated by the presence of the giant Soviet Union on their border that they never made any efforts to obtain information about just what happened to Raoul Wallenberg, why the Russians kidnapped him. We had reports that he was alive as late as 1980 in Siberia. And so our first major effort for the first 2 or 3 years of my husband's congressional tenure was to try to obtain the freedom of Raoul Wallenberg.
Do we now know exactly what happened?
We never found out.
Even to this day?
Even to this day, we don't know. Even after, the change in regimes, the Russians continued to deny it. They claimed that Raoul Wallenberg died in 1945 on his way to a small provincial town in Budapest. Raoul Wallenberg came to Budapest for the sole purposes of saving Jews.
So why did the Russians try to hide him? Why try to imprison him?
Well, that's a very good question. That has been asked for many, many years. The Russians were convinced that was a cover job. They didn't believe that any young Swedish aristocrat, which Wallenberg was, would want to spend his time to save Jews, Hungarian Jews, that he would come. They felt that was a cover-up, and he was really a spy for the United States, undercover. And they dealt with him, in the most...
This is fascinating to me, and he's certainly, without question, one of the righteous Gentiles of the world, and it's so special that that's what your husband did as his first act. I want to tell our listeners that The Last Days is the greatest movie I've ever seen. The Last Days, made by Steven Spielberg, starring Tom Lantos. He should have won an Oscar award for Best Actor.
He did. No, not for Best Actor. The movie won.
The movie won for Best Documentary.
Best Documentary of that year.
But he didn't get to keep the Oscar.
No, we didn't get
Spielberg took that one, right?
Yeah, but he made the movie.
But that was the best movie I've ever seen. And I encourage everybody to see it. And maybe, Mrs. Lantos, would you be open for us if we showed it in our synagogue one time?
Absolutely.
For you to narrate it, document it, and answer questions about it?
I would be delighted to do so. It is it's a very impressive movie. Probably one of the most moving accounts of the last days of the death pangs of the Nazis and how they were trying to bring down the Jewish community with them.
We're going to show that here in the summer with Mrs. Lantos, so you'll stay tuned for that. We're going to come back in a few moments and we're going to talk about Mrs. Lantos' own history, how she survived the war, and what she has future plans in mind for the Lantos Foundation, and what, if anything, she does with rabbis, if rabbis are involved in the Lantos Foundation, and perhaps what can we do for oppressed people in China today, aside from the Dalai Lama, if there's other people that are on the agenda of the Lantos Foundation. Who sits on the board, just before we go?
There are...
Just the top 3-4 people.
My daughter, Katrina Lantos Sweat.
Katrina, she lives where?
She lives in New Hampshire.
Okay.
Phil Friedman, from he has a big printing firm in New York. He's a Jew who escaped from the Soviets in the late 1970s and came to the United States and made a big career. The movie actor
Well, you know, I don't even mean to put you on the spot.
Bono.
Oh, Bono? Who's he?
The singer, Bono. You know,
I don't know. Bono.
You don't
is he a rabbi? Is he Jewish? Yeah. He's not a rabbi. He's not Jewish. I don't know who he is. Okay. My friends, I did not mean to put Mrs. Lantos on the spot, but we see it's a very prestigious foundation they have. And, of course, Mrs. Lantos is the chairperson of the board. And so we'll be back in just a moment with Mrs. Anette Lantos, the wife of Congressman Tom Lantos, who passed away. He was the only Holocaust survivor to be a member of the Holocaust, one of the great spokesperson for Israel, and how we could use him today with what we're going through in Israel-U.S. relations. We could surely use Tom Lantos to be a voice of integrity, reason, and strong support for the bilateral relations between Israel and the United States.